Hi, everyone. This is the Tech Surge Deep Tech podcast, presented by Celesta Capital. Each episode, we spotlight issues and voices at the intersection of emerging technologies, company building, and venture investment. I'm Michael Marks, founding managing partner at Celesta. Today, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in medical applications. AI is, of course, flooding into so many sectors right now. And today we're going to discuss one that has big implications for every one of us. That's healthcare. AI is entering every aspect of the healthcare ecosystem, from administration to clinical applications and therapeutics and research. $32 billion has been invested into AI healthcare companies since 2021, with another $11 billion estimated in 2024, according to a recent report from Silicon Valley Bank. Today, $1 in $4 invested in healthcare companies is going to companies that are leveraging AI. There's obviously a big opportunity here to lower costs, to address labor shortages, and to improve the health of patients. But it is still early days in this space, and challenges still need to be overcome in driving adoption, understanding the landscape of buyers, regulation hurdles, and other areas. To navigate this topic, we are joined by the CEOs of two emerging AI healthcare companies who are navigating all of this firsthand. Dr. Alex Sardina is the CEO of White Rabbit, a company developing products for earlier, more accurate cancer detection using AI. We also have Kalyan Sivasalam, founder and CEO of 5C Network, developer of a suite of AI products for radiology. Alex and Kalyan, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us here, Michael.
Pleasure, Michael. Glad to be here.
Welcome. Okay, so you are both working at building companies that use AI to improve patient diagnostics. But even within the same vertical, there's a lot of variety and different approaches and business models. Some are focused on early detection, improved accuracy, speed of diagnosis, expanding access, and others. So let's ground ourselves in where your two businesses are focused today. So Alex, let's start with you. Can you start by telling us about what you do at White Rabbit? What are the problems you're solving in mammography, and who benefits from it?
Absolutely. So a little bit about White Rabbit. It started a little bit over 8 years ago, and the founders had a vision of exactly what we're talking about today is where does AI intersect healthcare? But they narrowed that focus even a little bit more on AI and diagnostics. So they started looking at what disease process could be impacted positively by AI, and they settled on breast cancer. And appropriately so. As many of you know, breast cancer affects 1 of 8 women in the United States. But on the flip side of that, it's something or a disease process that, if caught early, has a very, very high cure rate. So the first reason for the product that we're working on is early detection, because early detection, in this case, does actually save lives. But they went a little bit further. They went ahead and purchased and operated 9 imaging facilities to understand additional pain points in the screening process. And in that process, they had 2 additional revelations. One of them being that the screening process today is actually fraught with an incredibly large number of unnecessary recalls. And what that means is women are being called back to have additional imaging, additional biopsies, creating a tremendous amount of patient anxiety, but also adding an exceedingly large amount of cost to our healthcare system. It's estimated that these unnecessary callbacks are costing the healthcare system about $3 billion annually. So that's a second reason why our product is we hope to be very impactful. And an emerging problem since the pandemic has been the shortage of radiologists. There's a complete flipping of the supply-demand curve where radiologists are overwhelmed by the number of screening exams that they're having to interpret. So introducing an AI tool that can actually alleviate, the workflow issues and the staffing issues is another reason. So I think those are the 3 main reasons and the 3 main subsets that we're trying to help address with our product.
Thank you for that. Obviously a very important problem. Everybody seems to know someone who's touched by cancer of all types. So, Kalyan, at 5C, you have a pretty broad suite of AI-enabled products for radiology that are already in the market. You have built a business in India, which has quite different market dynamics as from the U.S., of course, which we'll get into a bit later. But can you walk us through the problems you're aiming to solve at 5C?
Oh, for sure. Dr. S already touched upon the fact of radiologist shortage. In India, it's probably even more acute. Maybe 12 to 13,000 radiologists, of course, for a population of 1.4 billion, is really not enough.
What's that number in the U.S., just out of curiosity?
It's about 55,000.
55,000? Yeah.
55,000 in the U.S. and 13,000 in
And
India.
13,000 in India.
Okay.
And to add, medical imaging centers in India are growing at 16% year on year. It's a big growing market because evidence-based medicine is really caught up in a country like India. And so there is this radiologist shortage, and I'll talk about that a little more. But there's something more fundamental that's going on, which is why I think a product like 5C is so important for that geography and many other geographies, is that even with the shortage of radiologists are specializing. So today, you don't even have general radiologists. There are, people who specialize in intervention, onco, vascular, musculoskeletal, neuro, nephro, cardiac, etc., etc. Because that's where the excitement is, and that's where the money is. And we found that the diagnoses that are most often delayed, most often misdiagnosed, and the cases that actually cause the most amount of radiologist burnout are not the complex cases. That's actually what radiologists are genuinely good at, and that's what they studied for. It's actually this volume of mass cases, what Dr. X spoke about, for example, screening, which comes at such scale in the US. In India, the scale of chest x-rays, for health checkups, etc. It's these basic diagnoses, kidney stones, consolidation, pleural effusion, etc., that come at such a massive scale that it overwhelms the radiology system. And so we believe that we can build a machine to complement the radiologist and basically do 80% of the work that happens in a radiology department. To finally put to give you an analogy, I feel like radiologists, and Doc, maybe you can validate this. I feel like you guys are a lot like mathematicians, right? You're really good at arithmetic, which is the basic stuff. But then you've graduated to a point where you want to do complex work. Some of you want to solve the Riemann hypothesis. If I keep giving you basic arithmetic stuff, you'll be good at it. But at some point in time, you'll make a mistake. If I give you complex arithmetic 100 times a day, you're going to start making mistakes. And that's what's happening to radiologists. And instead, we're building a calculator for that. It's that simple.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That was a surprising one. Good for you. Okay, so there's some skepticism about the amount of AI hype we're seeing everywhere, and companies, quote unquote, AI washing.
Yep.
Or trying to thread AI into their product strategy after the fact. That's what everybody's doing these days. Mm-hmm. It's reminiscent of everybody being in the .com business. Your two relatively early adopters of the technology having been founded 8 or 9 years ago.
Yep.
So I'd like to hear more in more detail exactly how AI is manifesting in your businesses. Are you using computer vision, generative AI, deep learning, or other forms of AI? And explain, if you would, why AI is necessary to help overcome the problems you're targeting.
Absolutely. Look, I think, unlike Killian, where actually they're working on a suite of products, we are specifically focused on diagnostics, diagnosing cancer on an imaging, in this particular case, a mammogram. So AI is at our core. There's no AI washing when you're trying to diagnose cancer. And the only way you do that is by taking massive data sets, teaching them how to interpret different images, teaching them how to discern between normal tissue and cancerous tissue. So you have to have a lot of computational power. You have to have the latest and the most advanced algorithms. So we're using convolutional neural networks and applying those into vision transformer models to help the models and the algorithms be able to discern the two. There's no AI washing in that. You have to have AI at the core of what we're doing. And yes, there's other unregulated AI that could be used, or companies can be claiming to be using AI, but you cannot be in this space without having it at its core.
One of the things that I think our listeners would like to know more about, could you spend a couple cycles and talk about what you do with these data sets? And I think you have real technical people who are going through the data. Could you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, going back to mammography, why mammography is kind of primed for being kind of like the spearhead for taking AI diagnostics to the next level is because you have a lot of longitudinal data, which is key, right? You want to make sure that you're feeding these models with what did the mammogram look like 5 years ago, 4 years ago versus last year. Finding those data sets when we first started was almost impossible because healthcare systems and hospitals hadn't figured out the value of the data, had not structured the data in data warehouses. So purchasing the data or acquiring the data was very difficult. And then you're buying data that you have to curate, which means you have to package it, you have to put it in a format that's digestible by your models. And the other thing that you have to be careful with is protecting patient health information.
For sure.
Because we have HIPAA compliance in this country. You have to make sure that all that information has been redacted. So it's not only as simple as getting the data and feeding it into the model. There's a lot of manpower, and I think you can probably speak to this even better, a lot of manpower spent on annotating and curating the data to make sure that the models perform like they're intended to. It's like the old adage, you get out of it what you put into it. Good data in, great outcomes out. So it's really important that you identify the right data sets and that you have the right people curating it.
I mean, Michael, you use the term AI washing, but I want to maybe not bury the lead and kind of talk about why there are so many companies in the medical imaging AI space. I think at last count, maybe I at least know 700 companies trying to do medical imaging AI. But I want to try to, again, give another analogy to kind of explain this. Today, there is a clear signal to the market that radiology and AI are a thing, right? There's this radiology shortage. We just spoke about it. The other thing is that it is almost trivial to build out a very basic computer vision model. I can bet right now, in the next 30 minutes, with a MacBook M1, no GPU, the three of us, with Dr. Sardina's help, will be able to build a really, really good classifier for something as complex as fibrosis. Right? It is literally trivial. So the cost to start and just build a basic model, right, is actually zero, Michael. But the analogy that I want to bring here is that to go to Everest Base Camp is trivial. Like you three of us can literally take 5 days off, book a ticket to Kathmandu, and then 5 days later we will be in Everest Base Camp. It is easy to go to base camp. It is very hard to summit, right? And so I like to talk about AI, medical imaging AI startups as base campers, where it's trivial to build a basic model and then sit in front of an investor like you and say, I got a model, versus people are summiting. And the summiting is where you need all this data that Dr. Sardina spoke about, where you need to take an insane amount of data, have very clear annotation guidelines, and be able to actually bring models to 99 plus, whether it's in negative predictive value or F1 or whatever your point of accuracy is. That's where I think the difference between all these base campers and the summiters are. When you look at the number of people who are actually trying to summit, it's very few. The space is not that crowded because data, annotation, clinical knowledge is all it's very specific. And if you need to summit Everest, you don't wear the same gear that you're going to use to get to base camp. So you need different gear.
So where do you get all this data?
It's a great question. We actually had a very specific strategy in terms of collecting data. When we started 5C, we knew that in order to build a great AI company, you need to build a great data company. And so we also realized, as Dr. S just said, that these data sets are just not available. And we knew that we wanted to focus on single-shot prediction of diseases. And so we didn't necessarily need longitudinal data, but we just needed high volumes of data. And so we actually started our business as an online radiology company where we would work with hospitals, connect them to a radiologist on our platform, and then store perfectly the images and the associated reports. And something interesting happened. It is that a few years back, we stopped seeing new diseases on 5C, which literally meant that we have seen basically the world of diseases in radiology, which was really exciting. And this meant that we can now map this out and start creating models. So the beauty of our model at 5C is that we don't build models on 10,000 data points. Like we are in millions. For example, our algorithm that pretty much autonomously reads a chest X-ray today is built on something like 3.5 million chest X-ray data points, which are completely annotated and ready to go in. So,
and you're getting that data from the radiologists?
Validated by radiologists through reporting, but I'm getting them through hospitals and diagnostic centers in India. And of course, I must add that in India also there are clear guidelines today on data protection.
Yeah,
but there are it's called the DPDP, the Data Protection Act there. But it does allow for companies to anonymously use this data in order to build technology on top of it. And there is, I think, an India advantage in that sense.
That's a big advantage. We're going to get to the India advantages in a minute. But Dr. S., you might also, where does your data come from?
So we were very fortunate early on to establish a relationship with a very reputable academic health institution in the Midwest. They actually laid the foundation for the first models that we have. When I joined the company, I was able to kind of leverage prior relationships and bring one of the largest mammography providers to the table. And they brought a much more diversified data set, which is another key, Keelan. You can probably speak to that, is having not only diversification in disease entities, but diversification in the patient population.
Diversification in machine manufacturers.
Correct.
Yeah.
Sure.
Absolutely.
So important, yeah.
So, but we've seen a transition over the last several years where you're finding more data vendors that have actually realized the value of having good data. So it's becoming more accessible, but that's also driving the prices for the data acquisitions up. So I think your strategy and how you've done it by having a teleradiology foundation where you were able to kind of extract the data and the pathology was ingenious.
And the important part of that was not just the data. It also gives me a reinforcement learning with human feedback loop built into my business. And so I don't need to go out to collect data. I don't need to go out to enrich it. I build my own models and I do RLHF on my own network, and then I can take it to market. So multiple benefits by being extremely heavy operationally.
Perfect.
I mean, we hear lots of things about the future role of radiologists. Is AI going to eliminate their jobs? There's also shortages. I mean, is AI going to solve for the shortages problem? So what does that look like? Let's start with you again, Dr. S.
Well, I can tell you that I've been accused of that more times than I care to answer.
Accused of eliminating the jobs?
Yes.
Accused of eliminating your own kind.
Correct.
Oh
I'm married. I'm married to a breast imager. Fortunately, she's on the tail end of her career, and she's like, "That's fine."
Okay.
But I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think the demand and supply curve is so upside down that you need a tool like the ones that Keelan and we're building at White Rabbit.
Radiologists.
You
just don't have enough.
Okay.
And what's happening is, we all went into, and I'm generalizing here, but we all went into the field of medicine to practice medicine. And part of that is the physician-patient interaction, even in mammography, right? Because when you have to biopsy a patient, when you have to tell a patient, unfortunately, that they have breast cancer, that is a very emotional part of your day and is one that you want to spend your time with that patient and give them the quality of your time and education. And that's going away. Because you can't spend the 15, 20 minutes with your patient because you're like in the back of your head, it's like, I have a bunch of other cases. I have a bunch of other cases. So what we're doing is not replacing. What we're doing is making their workflow more efficient so they can focus on those cases and more importantly on those patients that actually need their attention. To your point, the calculator.
Absolutely.
Right? You want to get back to what you're good at. You want to get back to diagnosing cancer and walking patients through that journey. Where today that's non-existent. So we're not replacing, we're helping them get back to what they intended to do.
And one thing that I've seen in India and a few radiologists in the US have also validated is that radiologists are not just able to not spend time with patients, they're not even able to spend time with their physicians. And that is a big problem, right? A big part of radiology is communication to get to the optimal result for the patient. And many times that would involve working with the surgeon, understanding where a particular pathology is, what are the different routes of accessing it, how do they actually take out, let's say, a specific thing. Radiologists just don't have time for such things because, like you said, in the back of their heads, they're just thinking, oh, I got a bunch of other cases, right? And at the same time, they're thinking, I need to give this guy the best of my abilities. And many times, unfortunately, they kind of fall between the stools, right? And I think that there's an opportunity for AI to genuinely give back time to radiologists to focus more on complex stuff. There's a lot of stuff that AI won't be able to do in the near future, Michael. For example, we talk about AI to do cancer, and I think breast cancer is a great idea. But there are a lot of cancers that that never form a pattern. And it's very difficult.
They never form a pattern?
A pattern. And in the end, AI is pattern recognition. Of course, I'm simplifying.
Right.
But in the end, it's pattern recognition. And some of these are so complex that you'll always need deep expertise and deep oversight. And that's what radiologists are there for, right? And radiologists are the doctor's doctor, right? Head to toe, they understand anatomy better than any single specialist. And that's why they're so important. That's why they're so good. And building a tool that can take away mind-numbing and extremely high-volume stuff and give them back time to practice high-quality medicine, I think I would want a radiologist, if they're ever reading a case of my mother or myself or somebody like that, I would want them to have all the time they need. I would want them to have expertise at their fingertips. And I'd want them to be in a position where they can help me get the best care. And today, that's not the case. And let's be honest, but I
No,
think
and
we can get there.
I think you brought up a good point too, is that repetitive kind of mind-numbing work
Yeah.
that can be offset by an AI tool.
Yep.
That causes the radiologist to actually, when they're tired, that's when you make mistakes.
That's when they make the mistakes.
That's when you're going to miss a cancer. That's when you're going to call back a patient unnecessarily. So let's eliminate that. Let's at least make that part of the workflow something that becomes automated or becomes a lot quicker to get through so that you can focus on those complex cases.
You know the most misdiagnosed thing in India
What's
is
that?
actually fatty liver. So a non-trivial population in India has fatty liver. But because radiologists are so busy and they're all looking for the appendicitis or the bowel perfusion, that they kind of ballpark and eyeball the size of the liver. In many cases, there is a grade 1 fatty liver that could definitely do with maybe passive intervention, like, dietary changes, etc.,
Right.
which a good report will tell you. And a cool intervention that we have done is no radiologist has to ever measure a liver on 5C. It's automatically measured with a mean error of like less than the size of the tip of the pointer of the mouse. So it's always accurate. And so no radiologist has to ever measure a liver. They never have to reconstruct it. They never have to do APCCTR, 3-dimensional. It's all done for them. And if there's a fatty liver, we will call out that, hey, we think there's a fatty liver. And for this patient of this age and this sex, this is the guidance for fatty liver. You can approve it. And so it's now they don't miss it anymore. They don't have to just do this stuff again and again. They can take a decision based on an input.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. I want to dig in one more layer here, because what you hear about all the time is, is artificial intelligence going to replace people, whether it's radiologists or, robots or whatever it's going to be. But you both touched on a part of this that's really important, which is accuracy. And accuracy, as you know from just reading the traditional press, there's like AI is going to take over the world, and then there's like AI is dumber than my house cat.
That's true.
And so there's this whole question about accuracy. And Alex, this is a good one for you, because I think our listeners know that mammograms are not very accurate. There's very high levels of false positives and false negatives. And you were talking earlier about false positives, that people have to come back and do all this work and biopsies, and then they don't really have cancer. I've also heard it said that the highest level of accuracy for the reading of mammograms is if they're read before 11 in the morning. And you talked about being tired. So could you give us just a little bit more information about how AI in this field we're discussing in the medical field can really improve accuracy and therefore improve outcomes?
Absolutely. And I think you touched on it, right? There's a lot of things that go into generating a radiology report, whether you're generating a report for mammography, whether you're generating a report for a cardiac CTA or an abdomen. You have to touch on the liver, the pancreas, the kidneys, the adrenals, the bowel, the lymph nodes, the bones. And you have to go through that process. Again, going back to the remedial work of pointing all of this out, there's a certain level of pattern exhaustion that starts happening, and that impacts your accuracy. You're a lot more accurate as a radiologist if you can focus on the areas that the AI tells you to focus on. In a screening mammogram, it highlights 2 or 3 places.
Yep.
Everything else, with a certain level of confidence, you're like, I don't really need to look at it. Let me focus on these 3 areas. And then to your point is, let me use what I've been trained to do, a higher level of cognitive reasoning that AI is not there yet. That's what drives accuracy.
That's a great answer. And you really sort of hit the same thing by saying you don't have to look at the liver anymore. You can go look at...
You can look at the other stuff.
Yeah.
I think another good example is on a chest x-ray, right? Michael, there's this thing on a chest x-ray called consolidation. And it's basically when your alveoli are filled with something. The thing is, it could be multiple things. It could be fluid, it could be blood, it could be pus, it could be cells. And each of them are a completely different diagnosis, even though it looks like exactly the same thing. And so, for example, an AI that is able to detect a consolidation, get it validated by a radiologist, then goes into your hospital information system or your EMR, and then gets the patient history and says that, you know what, I've seen consolidation and this is cough and fever, and so I'm going to call a pneumonia and get a radiologist to approve that. Versus I'm seeing consolidation and the patient says weight loss and vomiting, this needs to go into the onco department, right? And then the radiologist can validate that. Now you look at the quality of diagnosis, because AI is able to reach in, understand that there is a difference in differential diagnoses based on past history, and then take action. And this is how I think we're all going to get more accurate healthcare.
Well, I think that's what's really going to drive the value of AI, and people will be more focused on accuracy and less focused on is it eliminating a job or something like that.
Yep.
All right, so let's change subjects entirely. So a lot of the big tech players, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Alphabet, many others, big tech players are very active in the AI healthcare space in a variety of ways. So how do you guys think about the build versus buy or partner when it comes to your AI tech stack? Are these companies you're working with? Are these companies that are going to be competing with them? So why don't you start first, Calvin?
Sure. In this context, Elon recently tweeted that, you can send up medical images to Grok and it'll give you an answer. And towards the end of this podcast, I'll definitely try to answer why Grok works basically, but why it'll not work in the market. But coming to your question, Michael, I think that if you have somebody who's built AI, you'll understand that foundational models are a very rare and very specific thing. And I'll be very honest, even on 5C, if you're building a CNN for a detection model, I'm either using a ResNet 50 or a DenseNet 121. These are existing foundational image computer vision models on which we then build our own layers. Then we quantize them, make sure that they're still meeting performance, and then deploy.
And are those tools, just sorry to interrupt you, are those tools coming from these big companies? Or
these are actually completely open source paradigms like ResNet and DenseNet. But on top of that, there are foundational models that are now coming in when you're talking about generative AI, right? That is, like we use a lot of Llama, which is again fine-tuned on a lot of our own data. We use Mistral. I think they're doing some really good work. For specific basic use cases, even a ChatGPT or OpenAI API would work pretty well. I think that to get to a basic level of accuracy, working with big tech can help. But is big tech going to go all the way and actually solve the problem? Probably not. And I want to give you an example. I mean, Google speaks a lot about the work they're doing in diabetic retinopathy, right? And they're incidentally working in my backyard in Madurai in India. And they keep talking about this model that they built using diabetic retinopathy. I think Sundar spoke about it maybe a year back at Google I/O. But, it's just one project in this behemoth called Google. And it's a great showpiece. I think to actually solve it, you need to go way deeper, get way more data. And so at the moment, we have found that partnering with a lot of these big tech companies, as you know, I mean, Jensen spoke about 5C and how we're using MonAI to build some of our detection models. And so I think partnering with these guys is genuinely advantageous. And at the moment, it seems to me that their healthcare focus is actually towards companies like 5C, like WR, rather than saying, you know what, I'm going to solve this for the patient. I mean, if you ask me, that's the right thing for them to do and the right thing for us to do as well.
Well, I just wanted to point out to our listeners that the reference to Jensen was the reference to Jensen Huang, who runs NVIDIA. Many of you know that name, but some of you may not.
I mean, he's now a first name basis.
Oh, yeah.
He is.
Alex, how about you?
No, I think you're right. And I'm going back to your Mount Everest analogy. I think the hyperscalers that you've mentioned probably get you to the base camp.
Yeah, easy.
But what takes you to the summit is the passion, the expertise, and the mission to solve that one particular problem.
For sure.
And I think a lot of these big players, as of right now, don't have that focus and that expertise and that passion or mission to get us to the summit. That's where the partnering with companies like 5C and White Rabbit comes in. But you kind of need that basic technology to get you to base camp. You just need the extra dedication to get you to the top.
And I'll give an example, Michael. Like you can open ChatGPT or you can open Grok right now, and you can download a chest X-ray or any basic X-ray from Radiopedia or wherever, and it'll predict it accurately. And now you're going to think, hey, this works well. But don't forget that these massive companies have basically crawled all of the internet, and they have all the openly available data of medical imaging. The moment you show it something that is, from a real life clinical scenario, it is going to fail. And we've done enough tests around this. And so if you take an image from Google, your Grok or your ChatGPT has already seen it. And we all know that testing on training data is like dunking on a 5-foot rim, right? You don't do that. So yeah, you wanna try to play with the big leagues, right? So
correct.
Yep.
The way I think about this is that these big companies are really providing the tools, and other companies like yours are using those tools at times to help
Fair to say.
refine the process. All right, changing subjects to our last sort of major subject here, one that I find interesting. We'll talk about geopolitics.
Okay.
So we are fortunate to have two very different countries represented here. One is the very robust, highly regulated U.S. market, and then the new
Upstart,
up and coming, not very regulated market. So let's talk about how this worked for you guys. So, Dr. S, let me start with you. Talk about the regulatory environment, where you are in terms of dealing with it, and then we'll go to the side that doesn't have to do all that.
So we've actually at White Rabbit, we've embraced the regulatory environment. And the reason I say that is, most of our competitors have pursued kind of a lower regulatory threshold through the FDA, a process known as the 510K.
Mm-hmm. Equivalence.
Equivalency, right? So you just have to prove equivalency to a predicate product. And that allows you to get to the market, and that's fine. I mean, those products are safe and, in use. But how do you create differentiation? So that's where we embraced the regulatory environment, and we've decided to go down the pre-market approval, or the PMA. A lot of people don't do it. Why? It's expensive, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. It's actually forced White Rabbit to internalize the regulatory position by hiring a VP of Regulatory Affairs, because
I think
you
the
have
burden
to
of proof is also way higher.
The burden of proof is way higher. But what is the one thing that people always talk about AI? Is it safe?
Yep.
And its efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
So we've decided to choose a path that has the highest regulatory oversight, that will give us the confidence to say we have the safest and the most efficacious product on the market as determined by the FDA. And that creates a differentiation from the other players, because we can go to market and have something that no one else does. And we like to talk about this regulatory moat. And we embrace that regulatory moat, because anyone who wants to follow in our footsteps is going to have to do the same things we did. And that gives us an automatic 18 to 24-month head start.
Yeah.
So if you're faced with this regulatory environment, embrace it. It's actually, what we've done, and I think it's going to position the company very well when the commercialization of the product actually happens.
I think we'll talk about the commercialization just a little bit. But Kalyan, why don't you address that as
in
well?
India, so recently there is a body in India called the CDSCO, the Central Drug Standards and Control Organization. To make it short, we call it CDisco. And so the CDisco in India is the FDA equivalent. And now, a couple of years back, the CDisco was also charged by the Indian Parliament to oversee AI softwares as a medical device. And that regulation came out of the blue for everybody. And to some extent, I would say that we've also embraced it very deeply. We understood it's not a regulatory moat like the FDA may be, but there is a reasonable amount of proof that we even need to show the CDisco in order to get an AI software as a medical device. The 510K route doesn't exist because there are no other devices in the sense.
Right.
But today 5C has the largest library of CDisco approved AI products that allow us to actually take them to the market. The interesting thing, even with this regulatory environment, right, in India where CDisco has come in, there is an understanding within each of the large hospitals that we have deployed in, saying that, listen, CDisco is a bit like ISO. It's a check mark. You need to have it for hygiene. But each of the guys we have worked with, some of the largest hospital systems in India and therefore the world, they all want to do their own pilots. They're all saying, hey, you know what? You have gone and certified your product with some government agency, and I'm happy. And I accept that as a certification, as a feather on your cap. But here are 10,000 cases. And I expect you to, build me a dashboard that tells me how many of these are normal, how many of these are abnormal, and what pathologies I'm seeing. And let's see, how well this is doing, opposed to this ground truth. And so in India, yes, I think that the regulatory framework is, of course, not as tight as the FDA. I think the 2 points that I will end with is that, one, it is getting tighter. There is now some regulatory approval, and it is very favorable towards Indian companies. Like if you're an Indian startup, like 5C, you get priority access so that you can take your products to market. And that's something, of course, that we appreciate.
Sure.
And the second thing is that in India, customers understand that products like what 5C has massive potential. And they basically run their own trials at scale.
Interesting.
So in the end, you gotta prove yourself, not just at the regulatory level. You gotta prove efficacy in that center where you're going to be deployed, and then hope to see some value.
Well, I think we can all agree that regulation is both good and bad. Sometimes,
Yes.
it's cumbersome and it takes a lot of effort and cost, but there's value to it because then people feel comfortable with it and all of that.
Yep.
In that area, let me talk to you, Alex, about insurance companies, which is a big part of how the U.S. healthcare system works. How are they involved here? How are you working with them? What does the future of that look like?
That's a great question. For the last 5 years or so, I've always been somewhat perplexed by the misalignment of the products as opposed to the end users, right?
Got it.
there's a lot of products, and the products have been validated by the FDA and by their commercialization to improve patient outcomes and make radiologists' lives a little bit better. But the misalignment lies in who's paying for that, right?
Right.
So the misalignment lies, the hospitals happen to pay for it, but yet they perceive the benefit as being with the radiologist and the patients. So that, I think, has limited adoption. Where I think payers come into play is that they have to start recognizing the value and the cost savings associated with using AI. And I think that's one of the things that we're doing at White Rabbit is educating the payers that a product that reduces false positives and actually decreases the cost of the screening mammography pathway is something that they should get behind. And if they get behind and if they reimburse, then I think that's going to change that entire paradigm. So I think they are actually the key stakeholder in driving adoption for some of the products that we're working on right now.
And what's the state of play now with those companies?
I think they're starting to realize that. Unfortunately, the prior focus of early detection has driven some of that, but they're starting to realize that what's more impactful for them, given the life cycle of the patient within their enrollment, is reducing false positives. And I think there's a lot of legislation that's actually in Congress right now where there's been discussions about expanding the coverage by these payers, specifically as it pertains to screening and diagnostic mammography. So anything that you can do to kind of curtail that expense, I think payers are listening. So I think the tide is changing, and I wouldn't be surprised, and hopefully we'll be one of the ones to drive this home.
Touch wood.
I wouldn't be, knocking on wood, wouldn't be surprised that payers actually start reimbursing. There's precedence for this. When the first CAD products came out 20 years ago, they were reimbursed.
I think they came on something called NTAP, right? New
Correct.
Technology Add-on Payment, yeah?
Correct. And then after about 15 years, they started realizing, well, maybe it's not as good, and they started bundling payment, which is what they normally do.
Yep.
We need to go back to that mindset of, if we're going to drive adoption for these much better products, we've got to reimburse. And I think the payers will be the ones that tip the hat.
And do you have the same dynamics in India? Are there insurance companies that pay for who pays for the use of these products in India?
I think last count, India probably had something like 35% covered by some level of insurance. But you can assume that a significant, I would say 80% plus payout in diagnostics is out of pocket. And so most diagnostics is just out of pocket. And in India, the way this works is all the health providers, health systems that 5C is connected to, they are my payers, right? So they buy the software because they want their radiologists to be more efficient. They want faster turnaround times. They want less errors. And so the pitch in India, at least, is straightforward. And I think that's also a very clean way of doing it. Like, I am serving the provider in making their radiology departments much more efficient in all ways, in terms of TAT, in terms of quality. And so they pay me, and their deal with the patient is their own, right? And the scan may be reimbursed, but by insurance, but that does not affect me. For example, even the government is a customer of 5C. We do a significant amount of AI-based work for the government of Karnataka, which is where Bangalore is, and from other governments as well. And the government is a direct payer. Like, they would cut me a check at the end of the month saying, you read these many cases, or this is the license we're paying you for so many AI reads.
So my understanding is that this is also the case in other developing countries, and perhaps you're thinking about going to other developing countries because they work in the same way. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, one is, of course, that the payer-provider market is similar, but also that the problems that they face are very similar, right? It's not like the market dynamics in many of these countries is that there are not enough radiologists, they're all burnt out, and they're looking for solutions to make departments more efficient and make turnaround times faster and make accuracy higher. And so they're all looking for the solutions. So as a product, it is definitely something that we can take not just all across India, which is many countries in one, but all across the world. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's like we as an investor are invested in both of your companies and excited about that. One of the things that I like about the developing markets like India is that there's a lot of pressure to deliver value at a very low cost.
Oh.
And that's a value
Tell me about it, Michael.
Well, that's a value that comes over to the more developed countries as we go. So, all right, as a final subject, and this is fascinating, let's start with you, Dr. S. What are going back to sort of the beginning of this discussion about, what people think about AI and is it real and is it good or is it bad and all that stuff we already talked about. What are the hurdles to overcome? What are the regulatory barriers? Are there other things that you need to do, and perhaps you as well, Callie, in order to get a higher level of adoption and acceptance?
So we've talked about reimbursement already. I think that's number one. One of the things that I've always, even before the advent of AI, healthcare industry, at least in the U.S., always lags commercial industries by 7 or 10 years in adopting new technology. And it makes sense, right? You're dealing with patient health information. You're dealing with illnesses, higher stakes. But I think there's been such an overwhelming prevalence of AI outside of healthcare that I think patients are starting to accept the fact that having some AI in their healthcare journey is acceptable. So I think we're starting to turn the corner. A lot of that also comes with education. Educating patients as to the value of AI in their journey makes a lot of sense. But I think reimbursement is still the one key driver to actually getting this technology to everyone. The world that I would like to see, and Michael, we were having this conversation over dinner last night, is providing access to the best quality care to all patients at no cost. Right. So if we have a reimbursement model in place that you can provide this to everyone, no matter where they live, no matter their socioeconomic status, that's what we need to do, because these models are there for a reason, and we should decrease any barriers that would prevent all people from having access to our products.
Well, it's interesting. That's the first time I've actually heard the idea that just the general talk about AI everywhere can be of value to patients who are no longer afraid of it or becoming less afraid of it because they know it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Part of life. That's pretty cool. So as a final question for you, Kalyan, how do you think about competition in the world of AI? Because we have these discussions in our partners meetings and all of that. Like how protectable is this when AI is everywhere and you know, you were saying earlier, at least at simpler levels, you know, anybody can do it. So how do you protect your business, or are you worried about that?
Obviously, I think Dr. S would agree that's something that we constantly think about.
I'm going to ask Dr. S also.
Something that we constantly think about. Today, in the world of medical imaging AI, at least, there are a few specific modes. Doc has already spoken about regulation as a mode. I've also touched upon massive data sets, massive representative data sets. And so, for example, in our case, we probably have, think 2 petabytes, 2.5 billion images of data across manufacturers, across modalities, across demographics, across diseases. And so that is one, of course, very valuable.
Sure.
Can it be recreated with a lot of money? It probably can. I think the second thing, at least the way I like to operate 5C, is aggression in terms of proving value. And so we are very, very aggressive in getting into large hospitals, not today in India, but not just in India soon, and actually proving to them that this is a product that can deliver value to them. And people think about AI as an API in many cases. And I think that is the worst way to think about delivering value through AI, is that each hospital, each health system has a different way of understanding how value from AI comes through. For example, at one very large hospital in India, they want me to take all their scans, triage them as normal or abnormal, and then have another AI, an LLM model, look at the abnormal cases and then triage them into either emergency or surgical candidates. And that is how value comes to them. And so we have a great engineering team that is able to orchestrate all these things together. And so there's this great article by Ben Thompson of Stratechery about how AI is going to be sold. And I totally agree with him, which is that you can't sell AI as an API. AI sales, at least to enterprise, and we are selling essentially to enterprises, is going to be a lot like mainframe sales, where you need to really get to know your customer, understand their problem, and build a solution for them that solves their problem. And if you're able to do that, you're building a pretty good business. And so,
well, of course, everybody has to do a good job with their customers. So we're going to finish this up with you, Dr. S. Do you worry about, for example, the hardware suppliers getting into the AI business, or other big tech companies we talked about earlier getting into the business? Is it possible, for example, that AI will get better and will need smaller data sets in order to be good? So those kinds of things.
It's always something you think about, right? I mean, I think when you're actually creating technology that can be applied in many different cases, you always have to figure out, well, who's in that space today? Who can enter that space because they're larger, they have more data, they have more money. So do I see a world where a product like what Kalyan is building or what we're doing at White Rabbit becomes integrate it as part of a hardware device or a gantry? Absolutely.
Yep.
But I think you hit the nail on the head, which is you have a question about commoditizing AI. I think AI is so evolutionary. It was revolutionary, but now it's so evolutionary. To your point, you have to stay ahead of the game by understanding your customer base and just staying one step ahead and outperforming what the market is doing. Yes, your leave behind products could be acquired and put into a gantry, but then it'll stay there for quite some time. You just got to make sure that you're moving on to the next best thing.
Yep.
So in other words, like every other technology company in the world, you can't rest on your laurels. You have to be working on the next product. So
always innovate.
Keep your friends and your enemies really close.
Well, look, we're going to wrap it up here. So for me personally, this is great because I love doing a podcast where I learn a bunch, which I did today, and I hope our listeners did as well. A real shout out to both of these companies who are not only doing a great job from a technology standpoint, but are really working to make the world a better place, and that's what we'd all like. So for Kelly and S, thank you for joining from India, and for Dr. S, thank you for joining from Dallas. So, and
our pleasure.
With that, we'll call it a wrap.
Thank you both. Appreciate you guys.
Likewise.
Thanks for tuning into the Tech Surge podcast from Celesta Capital. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it, subscribe, or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back every 2 weeks with more insights and discussions of all things deep tech.